Today, we're not just slapping together any old slab of wood. No. We're crafting a 12-foot masterpiece. A bar so beautiful, it'll make your beer cry happy tears. But here's the kicker. We're gonna carve it by hand like Michelangelo chiseling David's.
That's enough of that. Welcome to KingCraft. Now let's get to this build.
What's that total ought to be?
22.75.
Too much math already.
That is started. Basic arithmetic.
I know what you're thinking, another river table video, but this isn't your average river table. There's no slab, no epoxy form, and no going back after this build. So to answer your questions, we're using nominal lumber and panel gluing this bar to width, and we're getting down and dirty by carving out the river using cut-saw discs, which are no joke. They cut all.
Now this is the largest material we've ever worked with in our current shop, standing at just under 17 feet tall. That's 17 foot of mahogany going through a 6-inch joiner, a 13-inch planer, and a job site table saw. And that hasn't even got us to the logistical nightmare of doing it within a 40-foot wide shop. Meaning, we constantly found ourselves shifting tools, clearing clutter, and even opening garage doors just to get enough clearance to work.
Next up is the fact that most hobbyist tools simply aren't designed for boards this long. So, when you're working with boards that are 17 feet, you have to get creative. You'll need roller stands, outfeed tables, or sometimes even a helping hand. From there, one of the biggest struggles when working with long, thick, hard boards like this is that most hobbyist grade tools are simply underpowered for the task. The first issue you'll notice is slow cutting speeds, and that your motor is bogging down. The blade will slow, leading to rough cuts or even the risk of burning the wood. To compensate for the loss of power, you'll often find that you have to make multiple passes to cut through the stock, instead of making one full depth cut. This adds time, but also compounds accuracy issues. The more passes you have to make, the harder it is to keep everything perfectly aligned, especially over the length of 17 foot.
When you're cutting or joining a 17-foot board, even a small deviation can turn into a massive error by the time you reach the other end. Your tools need to be precisely aligned, and you'll often have to take extra steps to check the measurements frequently throughout the process. One wrong cut and you might be redoing an entire section. On a shorter board, you might notice a fraction of a degree difference, but over 17 feet, that can translate into an inch or more of an error, especially on cuts that need to be perfectly straight. So what does that entail for us? Constantly making sure our table saw fence, planer bed, and joiner fence are perfectly aligned.
Let's not forget that moving and handling long, heavy, thick boards can be physically exhausting, especially if you work solo, like I often find myself.
Eat a David, Logan.
We'll act like I didn't hear that and move on. Handling this kind of lumber, especially by yourself, requires planning, strength, and strategy to avoid injury or damage to your workpiece. Because without it, you'll find obstructions like tool benches, other machines, and storage racks can all get in the way. Simply turning a board or repositioning it after a cut can be extremely awkward in a tight space. Without proper handling techniques, you're at risk of damaging the board, bumping into tools, or even injuring yourself, which as a paramedic is no bueno. But let's not forget, fatigue isn't just physical, there's also a mental aspect. You'll find that your focus starts to slip, and that you become less precise with each measurement, alignment, and tool setup. Tired hands can lead to poor cuts, bad feed angles, or even more dangerous mistakes. So when you find yourself fatigued, stop, take a break, and store those materials.
Storing boards of this size isn't as simple as stacking them in a corner. It requires careful planning to avoid damaging the wood, ensure safety, and keep your workspace functional. One of the most immediate issues is simply finding a place to store a 17-foot board horizontally. Even in the best case scenario, almost a half of your garage space is taken between the lumber, tools, cars, and whatever else you can have in it.
That's enough of our rant, and sums up the challenges of tackling larger projects within a limited space. Which brings us back to Tanner cutting dominoes into each piece of the bar and countertop. Having a domino joiner is a game changer. It is by far one of the best options when doing a panel glue up. It ensures that throughout 17 feet, your boards are perfectly aligned, especially when you use about 30 of them in one piece. Now, that many dominoes in one project might seem excessive, but remember, we used underpowered tools to mill these behemoths.
After what felt like days of cutting dominoes and that constant vibration feel in my hands after, we got going on the main glue ups. Now what Logan forgot to tell you is that there are 2 glue ups for this project. We are doing a 10-foot straight wood countertop along with the luscious, never before seen, hand-carved river bar. For these glue ups, I began alone doing the 10-foot countertop, but made the back-saving choice to wait for Logan before I even attempted to apply glue onto any side of the 17-footers. And even then, this did put a strain on my mental health. I mean really, look at all those clamps and coals. Now on to the main attraction. The plan was simple. Glue the bar on the ground, then worry about lifting it later. And though not shown, we did dry fit this, but that was long before glue was ever thought of. We then applied enough glue for this bar to survive the apocalypse. Sadly, some of the clamps under it will never work again.
smoked my lip.
Huh?
You smoked my lip.
How?
I don't know. It moved
I
or
feel like
something at
you
one point.
smoked your lip.
Golly, that's looking cool.
Should have done glass inlay.
Fuck that. Ladies and gents, this is the moment you've waited for, or even why you probably clicked on this video to begin with. So grab your cut-saw disc and some safety glasses, because it's time to carve a river that even Mother Nature is jealous of.
Now before disc met wood, we drew out a very basic idea of what we wanted our river to look like, with a little help from Pinterest and AI, but it was mostly us. Then we were on to the glorious mess of carving, which we had no knowledge of how to do at this point. Nothing a little help from YouTube can't fix. Carving was a satisfying experience and almost hypnotic to watch, seeing your project become a masterpiece, imagining what water will do within the piece like an actual river. But don't get too caught up with your art, or you just might cut yourself with the cut-saw disc, which Logan somehow did during this build. Now watching this video, you might not realize, but carving was a 3-day process, each day adding more detail and definition to every curve, edge, and drop. And within those days, there's changes of tools. Notice how Logan went from a cordless battery-powered grinder to a somehow corded grinder? Believe it or not, we changed the battery on that thing about every 2 minutes of carving. And if we'd have kept that pace up, it would have been a 30-day carve instead of a 3-day carve.
We started with a blank canvas of wood, but we saw the river hidden within. With hours of precise carving, late nights, and corded lights keeping the dream alive, we worked relentlessly to bring it out. This project was about more than just craftsmanship. It was about capturing the essence of how water moves, how it shapes the land. Every curve we carved was inspired by the way water would naturally erode a riverbed over time.
Day 4 began and ended with us sanding the riverbed down and prepping for epoxy. Multiple items were used to try and smooth those jagged edges down. Anywhere from sanding pads, to sanding pads, and even sanding pads. Shitty joke? I'll hear about it in the comments.
We then delivered the bar to our client's home to pour the epoxy. Why? Well, because we didn't have a large enough controlled environment to fit this big SOB in, and our clients were our sister and brother-in-law. So thanks, Garrett. This was our first time pouring large-scale epoxy, and it was scary. So many variables that could ruin this one-of-a-kind project. So we decided on pouring layers, not only for depth of the river, but hopefully to keep us from messing up and or spilling epoxy on our sister's floor. We started with a blue tinted sealer coat that we poured on all open surfaces of the river. This not only prevents leaks after it dries, but also gives an idea of how much epoxy we will need overall.
Remember those variables we talked about earlier? You know, the ones that could ruin this project entirely? Well, this was the first of many. We decided last minute that we wanted more depth within this pour, and attempted to add white epoxy to simulate water wake. Sure, we had seen a project with this before, but we had never actually attempted it, nor had we watched a video on how to. And if you didn't know, you do not want to use deep pour epoxy here. Deep pour has a water-like viscosity, and as soon as we used the heat gun to achieve that wake effect, it mixed and dispersed in an odd fashion with the already tinted blue epoxy.
However, that fashion we actually liked the aesthetic of, so we kept it. We poured over it with a lighter tinted blue, but that's when we got arrogant and decided round 2 with this waking effect would equal an even cooler aesthetic, and put the first true variable that could have ruined this project. This second set of wake effect did nothing like what the first pour did. Instead, it created a, well, X-rated appearance. And much like salt water, are you catching our drift?
So tell us, what would you do? Would you try to sand it out? Would you try to carve it out? Or would you do what we did and add a third coat of wake trying to polish this turd? Now, I'm not calling this project a turd overall, but those X-rated spots definitely were turds. Or some other unnamed bodily fluid. We finished pouring large amounts of epoxy with this last coat of clear going over just the river portion. This ensured that the epoxy was just a little proud of the wood and could be sanded down flush with the bar top.
We did this using a tabletop epoxy without any tint, a clear if you will. But can anyone explain to me why this epoxy never truly got clear? We followed the manufacturer's mixing ratio as well as mixing times, but no matter what we tried, the solution was always this clouded color. Do you think it was a storage solution from the warehouse? Was it something we did? Let us know in the comments, because again, this was our first true time doing any sort of epoxy on this large of a scale, and this is truly something we're eager to get better at.
Now luckily, after multiple heat applications, the clouded appearance did eventually turn clear, as well as we built a dam for epoxy using caulk to make my life of sanding much easier. Sadly, you won't ever get to virtually immerse yourself in hours of sanding epoxy, as Logan and myself had no footage of it. Now with our third attempt in wake showing no signs of success, we took our beautiful mess back to the shop for some much needed sanding and care.
Yep, that's me again, and if you've been following along, then you clearly understand how we got into this situation. And well, you've probably been saying, I saw this coming all along. So we're back in our shop, cut saw disc in hand, and we're carving out all of the X-rated epoxy stains. Then backfilled those voids with a blue tinted epoxy. Insert mistake variable number 4 if you're still counting. For those of you that didn't know, if you find yourself in a sticky situation like ours, you never want to try and color match two epoxies. The end result is almost never perfect. Instead, what you should do is use a clear epoxy, as it will showcase the color below in a seamless manner. We probably should have watched a YouTube video before we decided to do this pour, because that mistake made us do it all again.
I know, I lied to y'all and said you wouldn't have to virtually immerse yourself in hours of sanding, but think of it as watching our punishment for getting too cocky with this whole epoxy woodworking thing. I mean really, this could have ruined the project entirely, and think of what it would have done to Logan's pocketbook if we had to buy all new 17-foot mahogany boards. And don't worry, any imperfections you notice was carved out and re-poured for a second time around, except this time we watched a how-to video. Funny how that works, isn't it? Now back to the build. Here Logan is cutting the bar to length and width using our track saw. Typically the track saw is one of the best tools for this task, as most tabletops don't span 17 feet. But what we built was no tabletop. This was a 17-foot masterpiece. Sure, Logan is going to cut it down to 12 feet in length with a waterfall edge, but considering we only had two 55-inch tracks, which only adds up to 110 inches or just over 9 feet, we did pretty well. Or I guess he did, because I was at school that day. Now on to cutting of the waterfall edge. You know, something we know nothing about. But no pressure, it's not like we're in the home stretch of this build or anything. Okay, all jokes aside, this is a crazy intimidating task. I mean, you are literally cutting your tabletop in two, then cutting 45-degree miters into each edge and hoping that they line up for that continuous grain and waterfall. Luckily, we had seen some videos using this, and stole some tips and tricks from an old offensive lineman for the Steelers.
Now, stealing tips and tricks is one thing, but we weren't able to steal his tools. All we had here was a TS55 Festool track saw, not exactly big enough to cut the 45 we needed in this waterfall. So enjoy Tanner hacking away with a flush cut saw.
You went ahead and unplugged it too, didn't you?
Yeah, I had to hook it up, so. Just like, here we are. Hey, don't you be mad. Look, here's back up. No, we're not throwing dust everywhere.
I don't need it. I'm throwing dust.
You're not throwing dust. No. You unplugged it.
And as you can see, dust collection is hooked up, but that's because I chose to, not because Tanner was saying to. And you know what else I chose to do? Watch him flush cut some more. Through? That's what I was saying. You were going to have two different cut lines like that by doing it like that. So follow whichever one's better, ideally. Whichever one's going to be flusher.
Mine. Or just break it off.
Sure about that?
Okay, maybe yours.
Yeah, I'd say mine. So, alrighty. That's fine. That's basically cut through, yeah. Here.
Why are you grabbing my hand with it?
Once again, I do all the hard tasks just to make Logan's life easier. I mean, just take a look at any of our videos. I never get to use the power tools.
Now, that's not totally true. That's not a toothbrush he's holding here.
That is indeed no toothbrush. It's our DeWalt palm router with an 1/8-inch roundover bit moving at insanely high RPMs. So be better than me and wear safety glasses when using any tool in your shop or garage. Now a roundover is for more than just aesthetic. It keeps those sharp corners from chipping off, catching any clothing, or having your kid knock their dome on it.
Alright, next up we're switching gears. We've got a section of this waterfall edge that needs to wrap around a support post in the client's basement, so a nice clean notch is essential here. To achieve this, we're using our Festool jigsaw and a square. We're cutting just inside our line, as later we'll go back with our router and a flush trim bit. Using a piece of plywood as a guide and a top-bearing router bit, we're able to dial in this notched opening to an exact spec. And yes, I'm better than Tanner. That's why I wear my safety glasses.
Yeah, I'll go back first.
Okay.
You think you can handle all this weight?
Buddy, I don't think you realize I'm an animal. Ready? Oh, Jesus, I didn't know you were tipping it.
Oh, I'm an animal.
Go.
Now, install was unlike most. With the request of a waterfall edge that then also wrapped around a support post in their basement, we decided it would be best to do the install and then finish the bar on site. Trying to finish a project of this sort in our shop, deliver, and install would have otherwise been nearly impossible. So what you're seeing here is us routing out a section of a knee wall for support brackets. This bar once finished will span a distance of 12 foot, so these support brackets really are not optional here. Without those brackets, what you're dealing with here is simple physics. Gravity. You see, gravity doesn't care about how many hours it took to get to this point. What it does care about is this: things with mass come down. So slowly over time, this bar would begin to cup, or worse, come down. So do yourself a favor. Get the brackets. Your future self and future guest will thank you.
You want to know something even scarier than cutting into the bar for the river? Cutting domino slots into the mitered edges. There was some serious clinching going on while I slowly pushed a spinning bit into an almost finished build. And like every user of the domino has said one point in their life, these dominoes help nothing with the structure of this build, but rather align it, especially for this waterfall. To glue it, we used Titebond 3 on the wood portions and a 5-minute epoxy on the epoxy sections. It sounds simple enough, but was quite difficult because we wanted those crisp, clean edges. Along with our sister and brother-in-law were in the process of finishing up their basement, so we didn't want to make another mess for them.
Hence why we used our Merkle palm sanders hooked up to the Festool dust vacs. We didn't just sand the waterfall, we did the entire bar ensuring there were zero scratches or scuffs from delivery. Which is another reason why we used a dust vac with this setup. It doesn't just help with cleanliness, it actually helps with performance. That dust buildup, it can clog up your sandpaper, which reduces its efficiency and wears it out faster. On top of that, when you don't have a dust vac hooked up, all that fine dust just sits there on your workpiece. Instead of getting cleared away, the dust particles get trapped between the sandpaper and the surface. As the sander spins, those tiny particles act like little pieces of abrasive grit, scratching the material in a circular pattern which creates those telltale swirl marks. Now, we're going to do a Rubio monocoat finish, so these swirl marks might not show up that distinctly on the wood. However, we are doing a polished finish on the epoxy, to which point those swirls would be highlighted.
Sanding was as typical as it gets, working from 120 up to 220, wiping with mineral spirits after each grit. And yes, popping the grain does work on epoxy too. The mineral spirits doesn't affect the resin in the same manner as it does wood, but it will reveal any tiny scratch or imperfections that need a little more attention. This ensures you're sanding both the river and the wood to perfection, allowing you to achieve the glass look in the river along with that semi-gloss finish on the wood portions. That brings us to finishing the 12-foot bar. It looked absolutely incredible and just needed some final armor before we could use it for God's intended purposes. That armor being Rubio Monocoat, a 2-part hard wax oil finish that works great on wood and epoxy. The mixing ratio is very simple. It's 3 parts oil and 1 part accelerator. With this project, we used anywhere from 12 and 4 to 18 and 6. It's hard to know for sure. After mixing for about 30 seconds, you're then good to drizzle it on and spread it out using a plastic squeegee or use any other method that you've seen or approve of. You then buff in the finish once all is spread before letting it rest for about 10 to 15 minutes. After its power nap, wipe off any excess and check for any missed spots, just to be sure. Now, like many other times, me and Logan did not get footage of our brother-in-law polishing this piece, nor did we get any footage of us applying N3 Nano to it for extra protection, but that's a different story. We absolutely love the product and think it's worth every penny. Now, sadly, we don't have any footage of us, so go to Cam's channel if you want it. It's Blacktail Studios on YouTube. He's amazing.
And just like that, we have quite possibly just created the most accurate river table on all of YouTube. This was more than just flipping 2 pieces of wood and filling the void with epoxy. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Start your comments off with David's D, and we'll be sure to get to those first. So see you in our next video. Oh, and told you our beer would cry happy tears.